all over the place. Yeah.
Thank you all for joining us today for the final Global Education Colloquium for the academic year. We're really excited today to have Dr. Rebecca Clothy, a Drexel faculty member. Dr. Clothy is an associate professor of education and director of the Global Studies program at Drexel's College of Arts and Sciences. Sorry about that.
There's chairs over there.
We're going to ask people to walk around, maybe. She recently returned from sabbatical in Istanbul, Turkey, where she conducted a qualitative study on the challenges of Uyghur immigrant community and the challenges that they're facing to preserve their culture as a diaspora community. Her research was funded by an American Research Institute in Turkey and National Endowment for Humanities Fellowship. Dr. Clothy has also conducted research on Uyghur education in China, where she lived off and on for almost 6 years. Among her published work, she's a co-editor with Richard Dilworth of a book entitled China's Urban Future and the Quest for Stability, to be published by McGill Queen's University Press. She's also co-editor with Kay Heidemann of the recent Another Way, Decentralization, Democratization, and the Global Politics of Community-Based Schooling, published in 2019. We're really excited to have Dr. Clothy present her research today. For those of you who are new here to our colloquium, we have a very active online audience as well as a face-to-face audience. So we've asked Dr. Clothy to present her research first, after which we'll have plenty of time for conversation going back and forth between those of you online and those of you in the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm happy to see so many of you here, and thanks, Christy, for inviting me to be part of the Global Education Colloquium. As she already explained, I'm going to be talking about my research, which was conducted during my sabbatical in Turkey. However, the story begins actually in China. So I'm going to be talking first about the situation in China and why I call this a cultural crisis, and why what's happening in Turkey is relevant to this situation. I think most of you probably know this because many of you have heard me talk before, or you're from this area. But the Uyghurs come from an area that's northwestern China. In Chinese, it's called Xinjiang, which means new territory. The Uyghur community, actually outside of China, prefers to refer to it as East Turkestan. I will refer to it mostly as the Uyghur region. But you'll see on the map where it is. And it's bordered by 8 different countries. So it is a very strategic part of China based on its location. In addition, it also has oil. Uyghurs are a Turkic ethnic group. According to official Chinese policy, they're considered one of 55 ethnic minority groups. And the sign, I took both of these pictures in the capital city, Urumqi. In the top picture, I just wanted you to see what the language looks like. They use the Arabic script, or a form of the Arabic script, which, as you can see, is 100% different from Chinese. And most Uyghurs are Muslim, or at least they identify as Muslim. There are varying degrees of religiosity within the community, which is also something I'm going to talk about today. So in recent years, in the Uyghur region, some challenges have emerged. And actually, this has been an ongoing problem. The first problem is that Uyghurs are an ethno-linguistic minority group, which means that Chinese or Mandarin is not their mother tongue. And the Chinese government is keen to promote stability and a common national identity, so they do promote Mandarin as the lingua franca, which means that Uyghurs need to learn Mandarin in order to go to school, in order to work, etc., in order to function in the society, even though the dominant ethnic group in this area is Uyghur. The government functions in Mandarin. Actually, the Chinese government, the Constitution of China does guarantee the right for ethnic minorities to use their own language. However, in recent years, which I will come to, restrictions have increased on the use of Uyghur language, and Uyghur language is no longer taught, as of 2017, no longer taught in schools in China or in the Uyghur region. The second issue, which has become more acute, is the right to practice your own religion. And even though China is a communist country, the Constitution actually does guarantee some rights to practice some religions. And Islam is one of the religions that actually is considered acceptable in China, or has been, according to the Constitution. Christianity is one as well as Buddhism. But in recent years, there has been some ethnic violence in the area, which has been blamed on Uyghur Muslim fundamentalist terrorism. So ethnic violence between Uyghurs and Han people has been blamed on Uyghurs becoming too Islamic, too fundamentalist, and therefore becoming terrorists. So the rhetoric has been that the violence between the ethnic groups has been caused by terrorism. For that reason, more restrictions have been put on Islam than what we've seen historically in this area. And by the way, this is a poster from 2015 that was everywhere in the Uyghur region. It's 5 things that were no longer allowed. They had been allowed before this time. So you can tell from the pictures, even if you can't read Chinese, pretty much what it says. Women were no longer allowed to wear headscarves that looked like that in the far right. Men couldn't have beards. And at the bottom, you'll see the Turkish flag was banned, as well as the flag of East Turkestan, which is the light blue one with the crescent and star. I think this really puts it into perspective, this chart. The budget for security in Xinjiang increased by 200% in a matter of a few years. So in 2015, which by the way is the last time I went there, and I want to tell you a little bit about what it was like at that time, so that you can imagine what it's like now. When I went there in 2015, I was surprised to find already that every 100 meters there was a checkpoint where you had to show ID. In the capital city, Urumqi, there were tanks. You had to show ID to get into a park, go through X-ray machines, put your bags through X-ray machines just to play in the park. I couldn't get into a park because I had a foreign ID, not a local ID, so they wouldn't let me in. So that was 2015. You can see the budget increased, and look at 2017. That's the last data I could find. It's off the chart now. I have heard that the budget for security in the Uyghur region is more than the budget for defense. And this chart shows you a comparison. So XUAR is the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Per capita spending in renminbi, in 2017. So the national for total domestic is less than half for the entire country. And then on the last column, Qinghai is a Tibetan area where there have also been protests. So you can see there's more security, but it still doesn't compare to Xinjiang. This is an app that everyone in Xinjiang right now is required to download onto their phone. This app scans your phone for things that are not permitted by the Chinese government. So generally, that includes Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp. If you have any apps like that, this app will find it. But it also includes things like your emails. If someone sends you an email, like even saying Assalamu alaikum, a greeting in a Muslim greeting, it will find that. Anything religious, anything too Uyghur sounding, it's going to find it with this app. The checkpoints now also will check your phone. So when you go through, they'll take your phone, they'll scan it with this thing, and they'll see what's on there. In addition to the security being beefed up, there were some other regulations that are more related to daily Uyghur life and traditions. So in 2016, there was a regulation passed that forbid some names that sounded too, let's say, Islamic. Some of them you can guess: Muhammad, Saddam, Fatima, which by the way is my sister's name. Those names were all banned. Arafat is another name that's on the list, which is an interesting one because some of you actually know a gentleman named Arafat. So there's no grandfather clause here. If you were born If you named your child, and by the way, you don't randomly give your kid a name, right? You usually think very carefully about it. If you gave your child a name in 2013, let's say you named him Arafat, now in 2018 you want to register him for school, they won't let you unless you change the name. Also in 2016, they asked people to give their passports back to the government. If you had a passport now, you had to give it back in almost every case. There were a few exceptions. You could potentially still travel abroad, potentially, but you had to apply and get permission, special permission. And at the same time, 26 countries were put on a list of being suspicious. If you had gone to one of these 26 countries, you were immediately considered suspicious of being potentially terrorist or having developed terrorist ideas. I put Turkey in bold because that's relevant to what I'm going to talk about next. But one of the things that you'll notice is that some of these countries border the region. So Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, these are right next door. There was a lot of business between these countries. People were going back and forth. Many people also had passports from those countries. Now it's not okay. Not only is it not okay to have gone there, and again, there's no grandfather clause. So if you went in 2013, and now it's 2018, in 2013 it was okay. Now it's not. You're in trouble if you've done it before. It depends on if you have friends there, if you have relatives abroad, if you're talking to people in those countries, it's also not okay. Probably most of you have heard about these re-education camps. This is a picture of people in one of these camps. It's not like summer camp. The Chinese government calls them re-education and vocational training centers or training camps. I heard about these actually for the first time in 2015. Usually the media says they started in 2016, but they started before that. In 2015, my last time in this area, one of my students told me his brother had been sent to one of these camps. And I asked him, what did they do there? He said, I don't know. My brother hasn't talked since he came out of the camp. But the only thing he said was they studied Chinese. So we know that from stories that we're hearing, one thing that they are required to do is learn Chinese in there, study Chinese. They're also required to learn Chinese law, and they're supposed to renounce Islam. Around 2016 or 2015, China passed something called a de-extremification law. The idea of it was to de-radicalize people who were considered too extremely Muslim, and part of that law put people in these camps. So, actually, Aziz this morning was talking about the satellite photos. This is a satellite photo of one of the camps, and the way that we learned that these camps existed actually is because people saw satellite images of these facilities being built. So this is a satellite image of one camp, and based on the size, so it has two sections that you can see, 5 buildings in each section, estimate of 190 wards in each building, and if you estimate there's 8 people in each ward, then you can estimate that there's 15,000 people in this camp. But there are camps like this all over the region, all over the Uyghur region, which is how we came up with the number that there's probably about 1 million people. Some people are saying it's more. In the Uyghur community, they're saying 2 million, 3 million. The only official number I've seen is 1 million, but that number didn't come from China. So we don't have an actual number. This is an estimate based on what we're seeing from the satellite images. So why are people getting sent to the camps? What are they doing that's getting them sent to the camps? Human Rights Watch actually put together a report of things that people did that got them sent to the camps based on interviews they had with people who were released from the camps. Incidentally, generally speaking, the people who get out are people with foreign passports. So this particular report that I'm going to reference now is based on people with Kazakh passports who were in the camps and then were let out. So some of them are related to religion. People got sent in for praying, for fasting, for eating breakfast before the sun comes up, which is something you would normally do during Ramadan, for going to a mosque, which, by the way, was not illegal in Xinjiang until recently. if you were over 18 and not working for the government, it was not illegal to go to a mosque. Now you can go to a camp if you do that. Other things, having a full beard, wearing a hijab, wearing a shirt with Arabic lettered writing on it, and I'm not even sure what that means, if it said something in Uyghur, because Uyghur also uses Arabic letters. So those are some things related to Islam. These are also things that are considered to be too Islamic. Not drinking alcohol, not smoking cigarettes. People got sent to camp for that. They were considered too Islamic because they don't smoke or drink. Maybe they just don't smoke or drink, right? And then some things are specifically related to being an ethnic minority or a linguistic minority. For example, speaking your native language in school. So if you're speaking Uyghur because that's your language, now you can get sent to a camp for that. Speaking your native language in a government office, which also was not illegal until recently, which now it's getting you sent to a camp. There are also some other things like talking to people who are abroad, knowing people who are abroad, having gone abroad. So anyone who is Uyghur or knows people in this area has gotten cut off from social media, including me. I also got cut off by my friends from social media because people are afraid to talk to people who live abroad. There's a very long list of these. Those are just a few of the highlights. Also, they call them re-education camps, but we also know that some very well-educated people are in the camps. So I'm going to introduce you to a couple of them. And I actually have a list to share these. I have 3 of these, so you're going to have to pass them around, but there's over 300 names on this of intellectuals who have been put away. And this is relevant to the research too, because these are people who are carrying the culture, who are teaching the culture, who are preserving the culture in the society. So this is a Uyghur literature professor. He is significant because he was the president of Xinjiang University. He was the president. First the vice president for several years, and the president. He got taken away. This is an anthropologist, a folklore professor. She was well respected, actually. She was a Communist Party member. She spoke Chinese. She had gotten awards from the Chinese government for her work. What she did was she was an anthropologist who documented Uyghur cultural traditions, traditional ceremonies, etc. She disappeared last year, and so did all of her videotapes. They also disappeared. So we no longer have that documentation that she spent many, many, many years collecting. This guy is very interesting. He's a writer. He wrote a book called The Art of Suicide. The reason why he's interesting in this particular case is because that book was actually condemned by some Uyghurs for being not Islamic enough. Eventually, when the tide shifted, he was considered too Islamic, I suppose, or too Uyghur, I don't know. He ended up being incarcerated too. And last but not least, this person was an editor for Uyghur textbooks that were used throughout Xinjiang. They taught about, they were the books that were approved by the Chinese government. Because everything that's published in China has to be approved by the Chinese government first. He was the editor of these books. In 2016, he was actually the first one I heard of that got arrested. In 2016, he got arrested when the books were considered not okay anymore. And he's also relevant to this, or important, I think, here, because some people think this is something happening very far away from here and has nothing to do with us. But his child attends Drexel University. So I just want to mention that. And I'll pass this around for you guys. There's 3, so you'll have to share. So all of that is, I think, very disheartening, very disheartening. But for me, the most sinister program that's happening right now is this so-called Big Brothers and Sisters program, where the Chinese government sends Han cadres, government officials, to live in Uyghur people's houses. So normally when you're transmitting your culture, you're teaching your culture to your children, there's several ways that people learn their culture. One way is in the home. One way is in the community or in society. One way is in schools, right? Or in other types of institutions. I talked about the security, so there's a lot of security checks. I talked about people getting arrested and being sent to camps. But theoretically, you could still have privacy in your own home, even if when you walk outside, there's cameras everywhere. Not anymore. They're sending these Chinese government officials to people's homes. They live with them for about a week at a time, but they come back every month, and they take notes on things. Are they praying? Do they have a Quran in their house? Things like this. And even if the parents hide everything, they will go to the children and ask the children, is mommy reading to you from the Quran? Is she teaching you anything about Islam? This kind of thing. And the poor kid. So people are getting in trouble that way too. And thank you, David, who is sitting in the room, for taking this picture, since I haven't been to this region for a while. Xinhua Bookstore is the government bookstore of China. You see them all over the place. This is a branch that's in the Uyghur region, and the sign says it's closed. Temporarily closed, by the way. Why? Because they're studying. So they're closing bookstores that sell Uyghur books. Here's a Uyghur store. It doesn't say temporarily closed. It just says closed. Presumably the people were sent to a camp to study. So you can see that there is, in many respects, an assault on the culture and the ability to transmit the culture. And so this is why I say it's a cultural crisis. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to see how people are trying to maintain their culture outside of this region. My research up until then had looked at how they maintain their culture within the region. Now it's impossible. It's not only impossible for me to go there and do research on this topic, but it's impossible to maintain your culture because you'll be suspicious. You'll be considered suspiciously. So my assumptions in this project are, first of all, culture is learned. Secondly, the communities want to share their culture, especially with the next generation. And that if their culture is, or their ability to transmit their culture is endangered, that they will be more motivated to find ways, other ways to transmit it. It's an ongoing project, so we never see a finished final product of this is what culture looks like. We can't say it's homogeneous, which I think is a mistake people often make, especially anthropologists. No offense to anyone in the room who might be an anthropologist, but there's no such thing as one kind of culture. People are different within every ethnic group. But most importantly and relevant to this is that the local environment where the community resides and global forces shape the cultural identity. And these are some of the scholars that I've drawn from for this. So I went to Turkey. I started this project in 2016. My last time in the Uyghur region was 2015. At that time, it became clear to me I probably couldn't go back and do research there again. Everyone I had interviewed or talked to, even informally at the time, was interrogated by the police after I left. And I personally was followed around everywhere too, which was extremely, extremely uncomfortable. So ethically, I knew that was going to be an impossibility. And there is quite a large and growing community of Uyghurs in Turkey now. So in 2016, right before the coup, and I did stay for the coup, I went to Turkey to start this project. And the thing that people were talking about at that time mainly was a concern that Uyghur language was not being taught in Turkey at all. Istanbul has about 50,000 to 80,000 Uyghurs there. It's the largest population in Turkey. It's one of the largest diaspora communities outside of the Uyghur region. What they were concerned about is that there were a lot of religious schools, Islamic schools, that were teaching children to read Arabic, but they weren't learning Uyghur. So that group of people who were identifying this as a problem to me at the time said they were worried that the children who were born in Turkey weren't going to learn Uyghur. That was in 2016. Things changed a lot since then, a lot. I took a qualitative approach. I spent a lot of time in the field interviewing people. I identified thought leaders in the community, and by thought leaders, I mean people whose opinions are influential. And these included religious figures, teachers, principals, board members of NGOs, people who, if they say something, people say, oh, so-and-so said. It matters. I had in-depth interviews with these thought leaders. And then in addition to those interviews, I did participant observations. I went to classes. I participated in every Uyghur event that I could find. That included protests. It included workshops. It included conferences. It included presentations, things like that. And then I had multiple informal conversations with people who I got to know in the community as well. They weren't thought leaders per se, but they had opinions, and it supplemented and complemented the information that I had collected. So a quick overview of who the Uyghurs are and why they're in Turkey. Uyghurs have been moving to Turkey since the 1950s, more or less. There has been a flow of Uyghurs to Turkey because of the cultural similarities. Uyghur is a Turkic language. Turkey is a mainly Muslim country. And so there is a level of comfort there for Uyghurs, and it doesn't take as long to adapt as it might, let's say, in the US, which is completely different. And people went there for university, then they stayed, or they started businesses. Even up until 2015 in Xinjiang, Turkish products were extremely popular. Music, movies, television, soap operas, fashion, food, you could find all of that in Xinjiang. So people who went to Turkey, learned Turkish, were able to conduct businesses and become quite successful. In 2009, there was a big ethnic riot in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, and a lot of Han and Uyghur people were killed and also arrested because of that, in the hundreds, the number of people. And at that time, the president of Turkey offered citizenship to any Uyghur that wanted to come or who was there, automatic citizenship. So a lot of Uyghurs went at that time and became Turkish citizens. My understanding is that only 2,000 people were able to get citizenship, and after that, they cut that process off. I know that path is not available now. Then people kept going through the usual routes, but from 2015, we saw kind of a different pattern. I was just talking about Arafat. Yeah. Anyway, so in 2015, a new flow of immigration started where people, they weren't promised citizenship, and because of the new passport restrictions in Xinjiang, they started to go through illegal routes. We started hearing about people paying thousands of dollars to human smugglers, being smuggled through Thailand and then on to other places and finally ending up in Turkey. Quite a few people went this route. That was cut off when in Turkey, they discovered a group of people who had fake passports, and the passport said they were born in Istanbul, and Istanbul was spelled wrong. So they figured out, oh, okay, I guess that's not a real passport. So that path got cut off. People also came at that time and got stuck in Turkey. So they went to Turkey to visit relatives, planning to visit for a month or two. After they got there, they realized that it wasn't a good idea to go back. In some cases, their relatives even said, please don't come back. So they found themselves refugees in a new country without even expecting to be. Since 2016, the landscape has changed once again because the Chinese government started recalling Uyghurs, started telling Uyghurs, come back, we want to get you re-educated, come back. And some people went back in the beginning for the re-education, and then we didn't hear from them again. So people talk, they started hearing, oh, so-and-so went to Xinjiang and didn't come back. So if they call you and tell you to come back, don't come back. Well, the requests started getting more aggressive. The police started calling people and saying, if you don't come back, you'll never see your mother again. Or if you don't come back, you'll never see your sister again, this kind of thing. Some people went back based on that. But fewer and fewer people started going back at the request. So what happened was the Chinese government appealed to other countries' governments, and those governments sent people back. So in Egypt, for example, there was a group of Uyghurs who were legally studying in Egypt, university students, who got sent back by the Egyptian government and disappeared into the camp system. I think they're probably on that list, actually. And so Turkey started getting these third country Uyghurs, people who moved from Egypt, people who moved from Saudi Arabia, people who moved from Malaysia. These are countries that have relationships with China, and people were scared. And honestly speaking, a lot of people who are not legally registered or don't have a citizenship option in Turkey are also scared. They don't know if the Turkish government will send them back too if China asks for it. So far, it has not happened. I wouldn't expect it to, but there's still that concern. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two different examples of non-formal education in Turkey. And by non-formal education, I mean schools that are outside the required education system. And cultural transmission, generally speaking, happens through, if not in the home, if not in the community, then in another kind of education environment. That can be a mosque, it can be a school. We see everywhere diaspora communities creating schools to teach culture, to teach language, to teach other things. So I'm going to talk about two examples that are very different from each other, but kind of represent the context of what's happening in Istanbul now. I mentioned in 2016, no one was teaching Uyghur language. People were very concerned about it. Now we have at least 10 or so schools that are teaching Uyghur. Most of the schools are religious because the Quranic schools now are also teaching Uyghur language in addition to teaching the Quran. This is one example. This is a very wealthy school. This school is located in the outskirts of Istanbul. It was founded by a religious organization. The CEO is a religious figure who got banned from China before 2016 because of his religious lectures. And it was founded with an explicitly religious purpose initially. It's in the suburbs. I went there by public transportation. It took 2 hours. So it's not a place where you can travel back and forth if you live in the middle of the city. Basically, people who go to this school live in the community, live very near there, and walk to school. So there's a Uyghur community around this school, which means that they are interacting inside the school and outside of the school. The school started out with religious classes, so they learn about Islam. They also learn. They also have a Quran memorization class. The purpose is to memorize the Quran, not to learn about the Quran, but to memorize it. In recent years, they've added on other classes, including Uyghur language class, Uyghur history class, Uyghur literature class. So one thing to notice about this room, unfortunately, I cut the girls off there because that is one thing to notice. Everyone in the school wears hijab, all the women and girls, no matter what age, so their heads are covered. Some people also wear burqas, not everybody, but some, which is not a traditional style of Uyghur dress, but it does indicate the level of religiousness. Also the flag. So the school is in Turkey, they've got a Turkish flag, but they also have an East Turkestan flag, which clearly indicates their position on where the region, the land, belongs, which is basically suggesting it doesn't belong in China by that flag. The curriculum also emphasizes the East Turkestan perspective. This is a textbook that they use. It's the history and geography of East Turkestan. So right now you can't get books that are written in China. So this is from outside of China, and it's their own narrative of their history, their own narrative of their history. They also have courses to supplement what they do in school. By the way, they start school here at 6 a.m. They go for 2 hours, and then they go to their regular school every day. And then after school, they come back for another 2 hours. So this is very intensive, very intensive. They want the community leader of the school, the CEO, and the principal want the kids to be together. They want them to be together. There's also dorms in the school. The people who live in these dorms are orphans. Why are they orphans? Because their parents went back to Xinjiang and couldn't come back. in most cases. There's a few who got lost in Syria. We don't know if they died or if they just, we don't know. But in any case, the parents aren't in Istanbul. So the religious foundation was able to pay for their room and board to live there. Also, there's a building not far from the school, within walking distance, an apartment building where a lot of Uyghurs also live. It's owned by a Uyghur guy. He likes to rent to Uyghurs, so the community is together. They're together. There's a mosque in the school as well. They have services every day. Okay, example number 2. This one focuses specifically on Uyghur language. These are weekend classes. The classes are held in a place that's convenient to public transportation, close to some Uyghur neighborhoods, but everyone doesn't live within walking distance. The community is pretty widespread. The children that go there have moved all over the place. They've moved all over the place before getting to Istanbul. So some moved to Istanbul from the Uyghur region originally. Some moved from Egypt, some moved from Saudi Arabia, some moved from Malaysia. So they're used to speaking a lot of different languages outside the home, and some of them don't even speak Uyghur in the home. The reason is, this is a problem many parents told me, they were worried about their kids when they moved to Turkey. They didn't speak Turkish, and either other kids made fun of them or they didn't want to go to school because they didn't understand anything. So the parents decided we're going to speak Turkish to them at home, not Uyghur. So now they're not speaking Uyghur at home. They're not speaking Uyghur outside the home. So they're going to this class and break or whatever is sometimes the only time that they actually do speak Uyghur. The curriculum here, though, is very interesting. So I told you about the bookstores being closed in Xinjiang. Istanbul has 4 Uyghur bookstores. And because the border is closed, it's almost impossible, if not impossible, to get new books. When these bookstores were opened, they were importing books. Now you can't. So the books that are there now are reproductions of books that already exist in the diaspora. Sometimes if I have a book, for example, then they can photocopy it and reproduce it and sell it to others. So that's where they're getting their books now, mainly, except in the cases where people are writing new books outside. So a lot of the Uyghur language teachers are starting to write their own curriculum. And the person I just showed you is one of those people. And I want to talk about her curriculum a little bit. So in one of the days that I went to observe the class, she had given the children a story that she selected, a children's story about a girl who went to the moon. And actually, the story was an American story, and she translated it into Uyghur for the kids to read in class. Then she created supplemental materials about why the moon looks smaller or bigger on different days of the month. It's the scientific supplement, and she always has a lesson like this to enhance the learning. Then for their homework, after they learn about this, they have to explain what they learned, the science lesson, to their parents in Uyghur. They have to use Uyghur to explain it. Her philosophy, the reason why she does this is because one of the reasons the Chinese government has given for not using Uyghur in the classroom is because it's not scientific enough. There's no scientific vocabulary. So she wants the kids to get used to using Uyghur to express scientific ideas and to show them that it can be scientific. So this is a very important part of the curriculum. She creates all of these materials on her own time. She works voluntarily. She has hired other teachers who are also volunteers. This is in contrast to the previous example that I showed you. They have about 8 or 9 teachers, all of whom are paid by the school. They can afford to house people there. They have a cafeteria. The kids eat meals there. So the religious organization has lots of money, and the non-religious does not. Okay, so I want to talk a little more about that. I mentioned that the way cultural identity takes shape has a lot to do with the local context and global forces, and we see that in Turkey. First of all, Turkey is officially a secular country. However, 99%, I think, are registered as being Muslim. And in recent years, especially after Erdogan has become the president, the Muslim community has become a little more dominant, I would say. And there's disagreement between the two communities. Not a friendly disagreement, I would argue. So people who are secular don't necessarily approve of people who are more religious, and people who are more religious don't necessarily approve of people who are secular. We see that in the Uyghur community as well. There are varying degrees. Some Uyghurs wear headscarves, some do not. It's a choice. When I was initially doing this research, some of the thought leaders were telling me about the criticisms they were getting from Uyghurs about their approach. As an example, one guy posted publicly that he thought that Uyghur language should be promoted and taught more than religion, that Uyghur language should be emphasized. He said that people started harassing him and telling him that a fatwa should be started against him because of his non-religious perspective. Another person said that she publicly posted, "Does anyone have a Uyghur instrument that I can borrow so that I can use it in my class to teach the children about Uyghur music?" And she also got harassed. She was called a sinner, like Satan, etc. So there's that extreme. It also happens the other way. People who are not religious, the non-religious community also very much criticizes the religious community. So I showed people some pictures of the religious school, was talking about it with some people, and they were saying, those poor girls, why are they forced to dress that way? I think it's terrible. One person said it's terrible that they are teaching them to memorize the Quran, but there's no understanding of the Quran. Why are they doing this? They should be emphasizing other things, not religion. So there's definitely a disconnect. I also heard non-religious Uyghurs say, we need to take religion out, 100%. I went to one event where the MC, it wasn't a religious event, but the MC was praying. He said prayers for the audience, and the person I was sitting next to said, this is terrible, why is he doing this? It doesn't belong here. So there's disagreement in the community. So at first I was thinking there's the religious approach and there's the language approach. But actually, one thing that we've seen is an emergence of more emphasis on Uyghur language since I went back in 2018. All of the religious schools now are teaching Uyghur language, whereas they were not before. And one of the things that people have concluded is that because of the current situation, the language is the most at risk. Islam is going to survive. You find it everywhere. The language actually might not. So here's a couple of quotes. One person said that people are coming together more than before. There was a lot of disagreement in the community. Now they're coming together more. Before, some people emphasized religion more. Some people emphasized language more. Now even the religious people are saying, we are Uyghur, language is important. And a similar comment, this is also about the religious Uyghurs. First they thought, we're Muslim, so we should study Arabic and the Quran. Now they think we are Uyghur, so we should study Uyghur language. Incidentally, I haven't come across this divide between very religious Uyghurs and not as religious Uyghurs in the US. There is a fairly sizable Uyghur community here as well, and I haven't seen this kind of divide. And I think it's because it's in Turkey. Some Uyghurs go to Egypt, they go to Saudi Arabia, they adopt those practices. In fact, Uyghurs that wear burqas in Turkey are referred to by other Uyghurs as Egyptian Uyghurs. They're not born in Egypt, they may not even have Egyptian citizenship, but they are called Egyptian Uyghurs because that's where they came from, or possibly Saudi Arabia. So I think that's one reason why there tends to be a more religious community there. But also, religion is not allowed right now in Xinjiang. So one of the first things people wanted to do was promote Islam outside. Now Uyghur is becoming more important. The last reason why I think language has emerged as a more important issue within the community is that now there's a diaspora. Uyghurs are moving all over the place. You're not going to find them confined to one area like you did at one time. They're in the US, they're in Istanbul, they're in Europe, Munich, Australia, etc. And so people are saying, they're adopting the local cultures, they're becoming citizens of other places, and if they don't speak Uyghur, then there's nothing holding them together. So this person said, as Uyghurs move to many different countries, without a common language, there's nothing holding us together. What makes us Uyghur if we're all living in these different societies without that? So the situation for Uyghurs in Istanbul, actually in Turkey generally, is pretty precarious. Most of them are not citizens. Some have residency permits which do not allow them to work. And there's a lot of insecurity in that community. So one of the comments that someone said to me is, we can't be thinking about culture right now. We're too worried about our survival. And I repeated that comment to one of the thought leaders who was appalled and said, actually, our culture is our survival. If Uyghurs don't survive, if the culture doesn't survive, there won't be any Uyghurs. Uyghurs won't survive. So I'll leave you with this. In February, just to show you how things are coming together, one NGO, actually two NGOs, organized a workshop on Uyghur language and mother tongue instruction, and they ended it with a event where all the kids who were taking Uyghur learned poems and learned songs, and then they performed them for this enormous audience. So I videotaped a song, and I'm just going to show it to you quickly. What's happening now in Istanbul is it's a lens and an opportunity to see culture being reproduced as it's happening and to understand the planful decisions that the community is making. It's not an arbitrary event. It's not just happening. Now they have to make sure it happens. And I think that's one reason why this case is actually quite interesting, because it's a work in progress and we can watch the work as it progresses. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, so we'll start in the room. Just raise your hand and Rebecca can call on you.
That's good.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm always inspired by your presentation. But the thought that just went through my mind was, how is this different than any other displaced culture? Like, our whole country is based on, I grew up in Cleveland, where there's the Slovenian neighborhood around the church and the German neighborhood around the church.
Yep.
And so, how is this different?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question, because there's many anthropological studies of these kinds of events. I think this example shows you very clearly how politics intersects with culture and power too. So, for example, the same group of people in the US don't have this emphasis on religion that they have in Turkey. So that's because of where they're located. It's also that they are swimming against the tide. A lot of diasporas, and this is a point I had wanted to make that I did not, a lot of diasporas can go home. So if your children are born here but your parents are from Slovenia, you can fly back to Slovenia with your kids in the summer vacation, and that will reinforce the traditions and the language. This group can't do that. They cannot go back. So the children are outside, and the parents want them to continue the tradition. So they actually have to find a way to make sure that it happens. They're making decisions about that in order to make it happen. It's not arbitrary. Yeah, so that's a couple things.
I wonder in hindsight if that hadn't happened in this country more.
You mean if groups have done that here?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you can look at, for example, Chinatowns all over. I mean, one Chinatown, I think, is a good example of a diaspora community trying to recreate some structure around being Chinese. But there's many examples like that. But again, to go back to this example, many of these Chinese people that came and founded Chinatown could go back. And so they weren't necessarily completely cut off from their roots. But there are many examples like it in diaspora. Liz?
Yeah, I have a question regarding when you were asking, you were trying to get close to the community. You had to dress like,
Yeah.
was it possible to be a Westerner, or
Yeah.
you had to convey some
Yeah.
image of women that
Yeah, that's a good question.
acceptable?
So when I went to the religious school, I tried to be conscientious about dressing more conservatively, which turned out wasn't conservative enough, actually. And I had a scarf, and when I went, I said, so I have a scarf, do I need to wear it? And the principal told me, you can wear it if you want to, you don't have to. And then I got out of the car and I didn't put it on, and she said, no, I think you better wear the scarf. So I did, and I actually have a picture that I took with her. I kind of wish I had it, because you'll see how obviously inappropriately dressed I was, which I didn't realize until I went. I had a long sweater on and leggings. The sweater went to here, but it had slits, and I had leggings. Everything was covered, but they wear skirts to their ankles. So even just showing that kind of shape, I think, was inappropriate. I felt very self-conscious and not like I didn't belong. They knew I was a foreigner, and they were nice to me, but I didn't want to offend them by not being dressed appropriately. I just made a mistake. In fact, I don't have any skirts that go down to here, so I don't know if I could have dressed like that. But they didn't ask me to wear a burqa. Not everyone was wearing that. Yeah. In Turkey, in Istanbul itself, in many neighborhoods, you can dress very Western, what you would see here, but not everywhere. So I was conscientious about that too. It depended on who I was interacting with. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What was the size of the campus in the suburban?
You mean how many kids? So there were about 200 kids in the first one. And it has existed since before 2016. But the building was new. It was built in the fall. It was really beautiful, 3 stories, and they're expanding. And actually, the principal of that school said the goal is to recreate a place where Uyghurs can come and interact in a comfortable space. And yeah. The other school was 1 year or 2 years old. 2 years old. It had started with 18 kids and now is 3 times that size. So it's still small, but it's growing. And she actually doesn't have her own space. She uses rooms in another school. But she's trying to get funding to expand. Any of these projects require money, and what gets funded is what you find. In fact, I don't think I mentioned the Islamic school has donations from Muslims outside of Turkey as well. Yeah.
Thank you for this talk. I learned a lot
Oh.
because I didn't know this
Good.
community at all. So the funding for the religious groups and not for the secular ones is just common across the Arab world. So you find that kind of everywhere. I was curious about, not really directly related to your sort of findings, but how did they explain what China was doing? Like, what do they understand?
Yeah.
If you talked about that.
Yeah, oh yeah, we definitely talked about it. So I was there for about 4.5 months, and my first 3 months there, I almost didn't hear about this at all. The only thing I heard about was what China is doing. For those of you who were at the film earlier, you know how they talk about it because you heard that filmmaker go on his rant. It's very distressing for them, and that's why my interviews were very in-depth. In the past, when I've done this kind of research and interviewed people, it's been 45 minutes, you talk. These interviews were like 3 hours. So they're angry.
Their interpretation,
Yeah.
what?
You mean why?
Yeah, China.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, so they assume that China is trying to eliminate their culture. They assume it's culture-based, that it's ethnic cleansing, and that their culture is being eliminated intentionally to make them more Chinese.
Do they have sort of an interpretation? Because you spoke to a lot of people. So do they have an interpretation of why China is doing that?
Yes, they
want.
want,
Haven't done it before.
not to this extent.
Yeah.
They want the land. So I can tell you, politically speaking, that China has a new project called the Belt and Road Project, and it goes through Xinjiang. It's creating a trade route similar to the old Silk Road with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, all the way on to Europe. I don't know how many countries are involved. Actually, it goes into Africa too. But Xinjiang is key to that area. And so China says they want to promote stability. They say their number one goal is promoting stability in the area because they won't be able to get investment if they don't have stability. So they took it to this is like stability on crack, I would say. It's like an extreme version of stability. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for a great presentation. I have a methods question.
Okay.
When
Yeah.
you are approaching diaspora like this, how do you identify the thought leaders?
Yeah.
And what is that process of getting access?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. I was fortunate that I have some Uyghur friends in Philadelphia, and some of those Uyghur friends knew some people in Turkey who were influential. And so once I was introduced to one person who actually at the time was the president of one of the Uyghur nonprofit organizations in Istanbul, once I was introduced to him, I was able to meet some other people. And actually, the more I talked, even in informal conversations, the more I learned who the important people were. So sometimes I learned about both of these schools through informal conversations, not through formal conversations. People said, oh, you really should talk to so-and-so. She's teaching classes now, blah, blah. So I would go meet that person, learn more, and that's how it happened. I always talk to these people more than once, though. Yeah. One more question I think we have time for.
What are you doing next? What's the next step with here?
Well, I just submitted this paper. I'm working on another paper with with two doctoral students, two different papers that are also related to Uyghur diaspora. And then after that, I had intended maybe to look at the Uyghur diaspora in Washington, D.C., which is also quite big. So maybe, or I'll find a new immigrant group to look at that's a little less political. I don't know. We'll see. I don't know.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.